History remembers kings, presidents, and famous outlaws. But every once in a while, it leaves behind a story so strange that even historians struggle to explain it. In the summer of 1862, while the American Civil War consumed the eastern half of the nation, life continued quietly in a small frontier settlement thousands of miles away. That settlement was Salt Lake City. At the time, it was nothing like the modern city we know today. There were no towering buildings, no highways, no electric lights illuminating the streets after sunset. Instead, there were dusty roads, horse-drawn wagons, simple wooden homes, and a close-knit community where almost everyone knew one another. Life on the American frontier was never easy. Every winter tested survival. Every harvest determined whether families would have enough food to last another year. Disease spread quickly, medical knowledge was limited, and death was an unavoidable part of everyday life. For the people living there, funerals were more than ceremonies. They were sacred promises. When someone died, family members carefully washed the body, dressed their loved one in clean, respectable clothing, and gathered together for one final farewell. The coffin was lowered into the earth. Prayers were spoken. Tears were shed. Then the grave was covered. For the grieving family, that was supposed to be the end of the story. They believed the person they loved would rest in peace forever. But hidden beneath the silence of one cemetery, someone had other plans. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The cemetery looked exactly as it always had. Fresh graves stood beside older ones. Wooden markers stretched across the hillside. Everything appeared peaceful. But appearances can be dangerously misleading, because every night, after the mourners returned home, after the lanterns went dark, after the city fell asleep, a single man remained behind. His name was Jean Baptiste. To the people of Salt Lake City, he was simply the cemetery gravedigger, a hard-working laborer, trusted with one of the community's most important responsibilities. He prepared graves, helped bury the dead, and quietly watched as families said goodbye to the people they loved most. No one questioned him. Why would they? He was the man entrusted with protecting the cemetery. But history has a strange habit of hiding its darkest secrets in the places people trust the most. Very little is known about Jean Baptiste's early life. Even today, historians disagree about where he was born. Some records suggest Ireland. Others point toward France. What everyone agrees on is this: by 1862, he had arrived in the Utah Territory and found work as a gravedigger. It was a job that gave him something almost no one else possessed: unlimited access to the newly buried dead. And for a while, no one suspected a thing. Then, something happened that changed everything. It began with an ordinary piece of clothing, a coat, one that should have been buried forever. Yet somehow, it appeared back in the living world. At first, people assumed it was a coincidence. Perhaps another tailor had made an identical coat. Perhaps grief had blurred someone's memory. But as more whispers spread through the town, the impossible slowly became difficult to ignore. One family believed they had recognized a dress. Another claimed a pair of boots looked painfully familiar. Each story, by itself, meant very little. Together, they formed the first cracks in a mystery that would soon horrify an entire city. No one wanted to believe the truth, because accepting it meant accepting something almost unthinkable. Someone was opening the graves, and whoever was doing it knew exactly what they were doing. The first whispers spread quietly, not through newspapers, not through official reports, but through ordinary conversations. After church services, outside small general stores, and around family dinner tables. People spoke in lowered voices, afraid that saying the words out loud might somehow make them true. Did you hear what happened? Someone thinks a grave was disturbed. At first, almost no one believed it. After all, why would anyone dig up a freshly buried grave? There was no gold to steal, no fortune hidden beneath the soil. And even if someone wanted to rob a grave, how could they possibly do it without anyone noticing? The cemetery wasn't abandoned. It had a caretaker, a man whose job was to protect it. So the rumors slowly faded, or at least, that's what people tried to convince themselves. Then another story surfaced. A local resident claimed they had recognized a coat being worn in town. It looked exactly like the one placed on a recently buried family member. Most people dismissed the claim. In a small frontier town, many coats looked similar. Tailors often used the same patterns. Perhaps it was nothing more than an unfortunate coincidence. But then, another family believed they recognized a dress. Soon after, someone else mentioned a pair of boots. Individually, none of these stories proved anything, but together, they formed a pattern that became impossible to ignore. The impossible was beginning to look real. For the first time, people asked a terrifying question. What if the graves were actually being opened? And if they were, who had access to every fresh burial? The answer was as obvious as it was disturbing. Only one person remained inside the cemetery after every funeral. Only one man knew exactly where each new grave had been dug. Only one man could disturb the burial sites without attracting suspicion. Is Jean Baptiste. Still, suspicion is not evidence. The people needed proof. And proof would soon arrive in the most unexpected way. Local authorities quietly began asking questions. They didn't announce a public investigation. They didn't want to spread panic. Instead, they listened. Who had seen the strange clothing? Where had it appeared? Who had been wearing it? Again and again, the trail seemed to lead back to the cemetery. As investigators gathered more information, they realized this was no longer a simple rumor. Something was terribly wrong. Eventually, authorities decided they had enough reason to search Jean Baptiste's home. Perhaps they expected to find one or two stolen garments. Perhaps they expected to find nothing at all. No one, not even the officers themselves, could have imagined what was waiting behind that door. As the lock opened, the mystery that had haunted Salt Lake City was finally about to reveal its darkest secret. But what they found inside would shock an entire community and transform a quiet gravedigger into one of the strangest figures in American history. The front door creaked open. For a brief moment, everything seemed ordinary. A modest home, simple furniture, nothing that suggested the man living there had become the center of one of Salt Lake City's darkest investigations. Then the officers began searching. They opened one room, then another, and almost immediately, their expressions changed. Clothing, everywhere. Coats carefully folded, women's dresses hanging from wooden pegs, men's jackets stacked in neat piles, children's clothing, shawls, boots, scarves. The deeper they searched, the more they found. This wasn't a handful of stolen garments. It was an entire collection. According to historical accounts, many of the recovered items still carried traces of dirt, consistent with clothing that had been buried underground. The discovery stunned the investigators. But the worst part was still to come. News spread through Salt Lake City faster than anyone expected. Families who had recently buried loved ones were asked to examine the recovered clothing. One by one, they entered the house. Some walked in with hope, hoping there had been some terrible mistake. Others entered with fear, already suspecting what they might find. The room fell silent. A woman slowly reached toward a dark-colored dress. Her hands began to tremble. She recognized it immediately. According to historical records, families identified garments they believed had been buried with their loved ones. A father recognized a coat. Another family identified a child's clothing. Again and again, the evidence continued to grow. Every identification confirmed the same horrifying reality. The graves had not remained untouched. The trust placed in the cemetery had been broken. For many families, it felt as though they were grieving all over again. The funeral had already happened. The final goodbye had already been spoken. Now they were forced to imagine that someone had secretly returned under the cover of darkness, opened the grave, and taken away part of the dignity they believed their loved one had been laid to rest with. The city was horrified. People gathered in the streets discussing little else. Some demanded the harshest punishment possible. Others struggled to understand how such crimes could have gone unnoticed for so long. And above all, everyone wanted the answer to one question. Why? Why steal clothing from the dead? By modern standards, it seems almost impossible to understand, but historians caution against jumping to conclusions. In the mid-1800s, quality clothing was expensive. A well-made coat or handmade dress could represent months of wages. Unlike today, replacing clothing wasn't easy. One theory suggests Jean Baptiste intended to resell the garments for profit. It is a practical explanation, but not a complete one. If money had been his only goal, why continue for so long while risking discovery? Other historians have suggested poverty may have influenced his actions. Yet there is little surviving evidence that clearly proves financial desperation. Over the years, some writers have even speculated about possible psychological causes. But speculation is not evidence. No medical records exist. No personal diary survives. No confession was ever written. The truth is, we simply don't know, and perhaps we never will. That unanswered question transformed the case from an ordinary crime into a historical mystery. Because solving a crime is one thing, understanding the person behind it is something entirely different. As public anger continued to rise, local officials faced an impossible decision. What punishment could satisfy a city that believed one of its most sacred traditions had been violated? The answer they chose was unlike anything most Americans had ever seen. Instead of sending Jean Baptiste to spend years behind prison walls, they decided to send him somewhere far more isolated. A place surrounded by water, a place with almost no chance of escape, a place called Antelope Island. And that decision would create a mystery that historians are still trying to explain more than 160 years later. By the end of 1862, the people of Salt Lake City had made up their minds. For them, this wasn't just a crime, it was a betrayal. Jean Baptiste had been trusted with one of the community's most sacred responsibilities. Every family that walked through the cemetery believed they were placing their loved ones into safe hands. Now that trust had been shattered. Anger spread throughout the city. Some demanded a lengthy prison sentence. Others believed no punishment could ever undo what had been done. Local officials faced an uncomfortable reality. Keeping Jean Baptiste in Salt Lake City carried serious risks. Public outrage was growing, and they feared violence if he remained in the community. So instead of choosing a punishment that most people would expect, they made an extraordinary decision. According to historical accounts, Jean Baptiste would be removed from the city entirely. His destination, a lonely island in the middle of the Great Salt Lake. It was called Antelope Island. Today, thousands of visitors travel there each year to enjoy breathtaking scenery and wildlife. But in 1862, it represented isolation. The Great Salt Lake was unlike almost any other lake in North America. Its water was extraordinarily salty. Its weather could change within minutes. Strong winds could turn calm water into dangerous waves. For someone stranded there, the mainland might appear close enough to reach, but appearances could be deceiving. Crossing the lake was far more dangerous than it looked. Historical records indicate that Jean Baptiste was taken to the island by boat. He wasn't left completely empty-handed. He was reportedly given basic supplies, some food, fresh water, a few simple tools, enough, perhaps, to survive for a short time. Then came the moment that changed everything. The boat pushed away from the shoreline. Slowly, the distance between Jean Baptiste and the mainland grew larger. The voices faded. The sound of the oars disappeared. Until there was nothing left, except silence. For the first time in months, the man who had spent his nights among the dead was completely alone. No guards, no prison walls, no chains, only an island surrounded by miles of water. Some historians have suggested that officials believed the lake itself would serve as the perfect prison. Escape seemed almost impossible. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run, or so they believed. No one knows exactly how Jean Baptiste spent his days on Antelope Island. The historical record becomes remarkably quiet. Did he build a shelter? Did he spend his days watching the distant shoreline? Did he believe someone would eventually return for him? We simply don't know. No diary survives. No letters were ever found. No first-hand account describes his thoughts during those lonely days. History gives us only silence. But that silence would not last forever, because when people finally returned to check on the isolated gravedigger, they expected to find a prisoner. Instead, they found the beginning of an even greater mystery. Jean Baptiste was nowhere to be seen. No body, no sign of a struggle, no farewell message, nothing. The man who had terrified an entire city had disappeared. And with that disappearance, the story changed forever. What began as a disturbing criminal investigation had become one of America's most forgotten, unsolved historical mysteries. Days passed, then more days. Life in Salt Lake City slowly returned to normal. The shocking discovery inside Jean Baptiste's home was no longer the only topic of conversation. People believed the nightmare was finally over. The gravedigger was gone. The cemetery was safe again. Families could once again visit the graves of their loved ones without fear. Or so they thought. At some point after Jean Baptiste had been left on Antelope Island, people returned to check on him. Exactly how much time had passed is uncertain. The historical record does not provide a precise timeline. But what happened next has puzzled historians ever since. As the boat approached the shoreline, something felt wrong. There was no sign of movement, no smoke rising into the sky, no figure standing on the beach waiting for supplies. The island was strangely quiet. When the visitors stepped onto the shore, they began searching. They called his name. No answer. They searched the area where he had reportedly been left. Nothing. No sign of Jean Baptiste. At first, they may have believed he had wandered farther inland. After all, Antelope Island is much larger than many people imagine. Its rolling hills, rocky terrain, and open grasslands can easily hide a person from view. The search continued. The shoreline was examined. The nearby hills were checked. But with every passing hour, the same question became harder to ignore. Where had he gone? There were no reliable eyewitnesses claiming they had seen him leave. No official record describing a successful escape. No confirmed body recovered from the lake. No final message. It was as though he had simply vanished. For a man whose crimes had horrified an entire city, it was an astonishing ending. The hunter of graves had become a mystery himself, and that mystery has survived for more than a century and a half. Over time, stories began to spread. Some were based on facts. Others were little more than rumors, passed from one generation to the next. Separating truth from legend became increasingly difficult. This is where many historical mysteries become complicated. When evidence is limited, imagination often fills the gaps. Some newspapers repeated unverified claims. Local legends grew more dramatic with each passing decade. But historians must be careful. A good story is not always a true story. What we know with confidence is surprisingly limited. Jean Baptiste was exiled. Later, he was no longer on Antelope Island. Everything beyond those documented facts enters the realm of theory rather than certainty. And yet, those theories are exactly what have kept this case alive for more than 160 years. Because every unanswered mystery invites the same question. What really happened? Was the lake responsible? Did Jean Baptiste somehow escape? Or did someone else write the final chapter of his life? The evidence refuses to give us a clear answer. But history has left behind just enough clues to keep the mystery alive. And those clues have inspired three major theories, each attempting to explain the disappearance of the man who stole from the dead. Every unsolved mystery eventually reaches the same point. The evidence ends, and the theories begin. The disappearance of Jean Baptiste is no exception. More than 160 years later, historians still cannot say with certainty what happened after he vanished from Antelope Island. But based on the surviving historical record, three major theories have emerged. Some are more convincing than others, yet none have ever been proven. Theory 1. He drowned. For many historians, this is the most likely explanation. To understand why, you first need to understand the Great Salt Lake. From a distance, it looks peaceful, almost inviting. But appearances can be deceiving. The lake is enormous. Its weather can change with surprising speed. Powerful winds can create dangerous waves, even on days that begin with calm skies. In the 1860s, there were no rescue teams, no emergency radios, no Coast Guard waiting nearby. If Jean Baptiste attempted to escape, using a small raft, or even tried to swim, his chances of survival would have been extremely small. Some historians believe he underestimated the lake. Others believe desperation pushed him to take the risk anyway. If he drowned, the mystery would have ended almost immediately. Yet one question remains. If that happened, why was no body ever recovered? The answer may simply be that nature doesn't always return its secrets, especially in a lake as vast and unpredictable as the Great Salt Lake. Still, without physical evidence, even the most reasonable theory remains only a theory. Theory 2. He escaped. What if Jean Baptiste succeeded? As unlikely as it sounds, some historians believe it cannot be completely ruled out. Remember, this was the American frontier. The year was 1862. Large parts of the western United States were still developing. Thousands of people moved from one territory to another every year. Many had no official identification. Photographs were rare. Communication between distant communities was slow. A man could disappear into another town, find work, adopt a different name, and leave very little trace behind. Could Jean Baptiste have done exactly that? There is no surviving document proving he escaped, but there is also no document proving that he didn't. History leaves the question unanswered, and sometimes an unanswered question is all it takes for a mystery to survive for generations. Theory 3. Revenge. The third theory is the most dramatic, but it is also the weakest from a historical standpoint. Over the decades, local stories began claiming that Jean Baptiste never escaped at all. Instead, some believed angry citizens secretly returned to Antelope Island and took revenge. According to these stories, the law had failed to deliver justice, so ordinary people delivered it themselves. It certainly sounds like the ending of a Hollywood film, but there is a problem. No reliable historical document supports the story. No newspaper from the time confirms it. No official investigation recorded it. No credible eyewitness account survives. That doesn't necessarily mean it was impossible, but historians cannot treat folklore as fact, and that distinction is important. Because real history isn't built on the stories we wish were true. It's built on the evidence that survives. In Jean Baptiste's case, the evidence leaves us with possibilities, not certainty. Perhaps he drowned. Perhaps he escaped. Perhaps the truth disappeared forever with the man himself. Whatever happened on that lonely island, one thing is certain. Jean Baptiste entered history as a grave robber, but he became a legend the moment he vanished. Some mysteries are solved by science. Others are solved by time. And then, there are mysteries like this one, stories that refuse to give us a final answer. More than a century and a half has passed since the people of Salt Lake City uncovered one of the strangest crimes in their young community. The city has changed almost beyond recognition. The dusty frontier roads have become modern highways. The quiet settlement has grown into a thriving city. Generations have come and gone. Yet one question still echoes through history. What really happened to Jean Baptiste? The facts we know are surprisingly few. A cemetery gravedigger betrayed the trust placed in him. Authorities discovered clothing believed to have been taken from recently buried men, women, and children. The community was horrified. Instead of a conventional prison sentence, he was exiled to Antelope Island. Sometime later, he disappeared. Everything after that becomes silence. As historians, we have to accept something that can be frustrating. Not every mystery has an ending. Sometimes the evidence simply runs out. Old records are lost. Witnesses pass away. Documents disappear. And the truth slowly fades into history. That is why this case continues to fascinate researchers today. Not because it is America's largest crime, not because it is the most violent, but because it reminds us how fragile history can be. One missing document, one forgotten witness, one unexplained disappearance, and an entire chapter of the past can remain unfinished forever. Perhaps Jean Baptiste drowned while trying to escape the Great Salt Lake. Perhaps he reached the mainland and spent the rest of his life under a new identity. Or perhaps the real answer is something no one has ever imagined. We may never know, and maybe that uncertainty is exactly why this story has survived for more than 160 years. History is often described as a collection of facts, but sometimes history is also a collection of unanswered questions. Questions that challenge us to keep searching, to keep reading, and to remember that even the most carefully documented past still contains hidden mysteries. Jean Baptiste's story isn't just about stolen clothing. It isn't just about disturbed graves. It's about trust. It's about how one person's actions can leave an entire community questioning its sense of safety. And above all, it's about a mystery that has outlived everyone involved. The people who buried their loved ones are gone. The investigators are gone. The witnesses are gone. Even Jean Baptiste himself vanished, without leaving behind a final page. Only the story remains. waiting for each new generation to ask the same question: what really happened on Antelope Island? Perhaps one day, a forgotten newspaper, a hidden diary, or an overlooked historical record will finally reveal the truth. Until then, Jean Baptiste will remain exactly what history has made him: a man trusted to protect the dead, who disappeared before history could write his ending. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy forgotten true stories, unsolved historical mysteries, and documentaries based on real records, consider subscribing. Because history is full of stories that are stranger than fiction. They're simply waiting to be discovered. And remember, the greatest mysteries aren't always the ones that were hidden. Sometimes, they're the ones history forgot.